The morning light filtered through Sarah Mitchell's apartment window at 5:47 a.m., but she hadn't slept. She'd stopped sleeping months ago, ever since David took Emma. Sleep had become impossible, replaced by an endless cycle of worry, fear, and desperate hope. She sat on the edge of her bed, still wearing yesterday's clothes, staring at the photograph on her nightstand. Emma, age 3, with her gap-toothed smile and pigtails slightly crooked, laughing at something Sarah had said just before snapping the picture. That was 6 weeks ago. 6 weeks since David's lawyer had convinced a judge to grant him temporary custody pending the full hearing. 6 weeks of phone calls that were carefully monitored, supervised visits that lasted only 2 hours, and nights filled with anguish wondering if her daughter was okay, if she was eating enough, if she remembered her mother. Sarah dragged herself to the shower, standing under scalding water for nearly 30 minutes, as if the heat could burn away the anxiety that had nested permanently in her chest. Her hands shook as she dried off and moved to her closet. She'd bought this outfit specifically for today, a navy blazer, pressed slacks, a cream blouse, professional, composed, trustworthy, the clothes of a mother who deserved custody of her child. Her lawyer had been explicit. The judge will be watching everything. How you dress, how you speak, how you react. Everything matters, Sarah, everything. The drive to Hamilton County Courthouse took 35 minutes through rush hour traffic. Sarah gripped the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles turned white. Her mind replayed the events of the past 8 months like a broken record. The initial separation from David had been messy but cordial. They'd both agreed it wasn't working, that Emma deserved parents who could at least pretend civility. But then David's new girlfriend had moved in, a woman named whom Sarah had never trusted. Was young, childless, and completely uninterested in the complexities of co-parenting a 3-year-old. 3 weeks into the separation, David had filed for emergency custody, citing Sarah's unstable work environment and inability to provide proper. It was a complete fabrication. Sarah had been a devoted, present mother every single day of Emma's life. Yet David's lawyer, a ruthless man named Harold who specialized in custody battles, had twisted facts and manipulated the system. He'd had witnesses testify that Sarah was frequently unavailable, though these witnesses were people David barely knew. He'd suggested that Sarah's modest income made her less capable than David's substantial salary. The judge at the initial hearing, a man who seemed more sympathetic to David's polished presentation, had granted temporary custody pending today's full hearing. Sarah pulled into the courthouse parking lot at 8:15 a.m., 45 minutes early. She needed time to center herself, to prepare mentally for what was coming. Was already there, standing outside the building with 2 cups of coffee. She handed one to Sarah and studied her face with the practiced eye of someone who'd fought many custody battles. "How are you holding up?" asked, though she could clearly see the answer written across Sarah's exhausted features. "I haven't slept in 3 days," Sarah admitted. What if the judge doesn't believe me? What if?" "Stop," interrupted gently but firmly. "We've been through this. We have documentation, we have witnesses, we have your entire history as a mother. Emma was born to you. You've never neglected her. You've never endangered her. You have every right to be her primary guardian, and the judge needs to see that." They climbed the courthouse steps together, Sarah's legs feeling weak beneath her. The hallway was crowded with lawyers, clients, and various court personnel. The noise was overwhelming, echoing conversations, ringing phones, the sound of official business being conducted. They found the correct courtroom and entered the waiting area outside. And there he was. David Mitchell sat with hovering nearby, both of them looking irritatingly calm. David wore an expensive suit, his hair perfectly styled, his expression projecting confidence and success. Beside him, Harold reviewed documents, occasionally making notes with a gold pen. Sarah felt her stomach clench with a mixture of anger and despair. How could someone be so composed when his actions were about to be judged? How could he sit there so calmly when they were deciding the fate of their daughter? Gently touched Sarah's elbow and guided her to sit in a different section of the hallway. "Don't engage," she whispered. "Don't look at him. Don't react. We let the evidence speak." Sarah nodded, but inside she was screaming. She pulled out her phone and looked at Emma's photos again. There was one of Emma's third birthday just 2 months ago. Sarah had planned the entire day, cupcakes shaped like butterflies, a princess-themed party with balloons and streamers, 6 of Emma's little friends from preschool. Emma had been so happy, so alive, and Sarah had captured every moment, certain these memories would sustain her through whatever came next. Now, looking at those images felt like torture. When would she see her daughter again? Would Emma remember these happy moments? At 9:00 a.m. precisely, a clerk emerged and called for everyone to enter the courtroom. Sarah's heart began pounding so violently she thought it might explode from her chest. This was it. This was the moment. Stood, offering her hand to help Sarah up. Inside the courtroom, the space felt simultaneously intimate and vast. The judge's bench loomed at the front, currently empty. There were 2 tables, one for each side. Sarah sat at the table across from David and Harold. Behind them behind Sarah sat her best friend, Jennifer, who'd taken the morning off work to be there for support. The bailiff announced the judge's entrance. "All rise for the Honorable Judge Richard Thornton." He was an older man with reading glasses and a serious expression. He didn't smile. He settled himself at his bench, adjusted his position, and looked out at the courtroom with the gravity of someone about to make life-altering decisions. His gaze swept across both tables, lingering for just a moment on Sarah's face before moving to David's. "This is the custody hearing for Emma Mitchell," he announced. "Before we begin, I want to remind everyone that the sole consideration in this case is the best interest of the child. Everything else, everything, is secondary." He looked directly at David, then directly at Sarah. "Is that understood?" Both nodded. "Very well. We will hear opening statements beginning with the petitioner." He gestured to David's lawyer. Harold stood, adjusting his tie, preparing to tell the judge a version of events that Sarah knew was carefully crafted to paint her as an inadequate mother. Sarah clutched hand beneath the table. Her entire future, Emma's entire future, hung in the balance. Nobody in that courtroom yet understood what was about to unfold, the incredible chain of events that would be set in motion by this single morning. But as the judge's gavel came down and the hearing officially began, Sarah whispered a silent prayer. "Please, please let me be heard. Please let Emma come home." The courtroom fell silent, waiting. Harold spoke for 35 minutes straight. His opening statement was in manipulation, painting Sarah as a negligent mother who'd become increasingly unstable following the separation. He cited her supposed erratic work schedule, her emotional volatility, and her inability to provide a stable environment. Every word was a dagger aimed at Sarah's heart. She sat rigidly, her jaw clenched so tightly she feared her teeth might crack. Had warned her this would be difficult, but hearing her entire life as a mother reduced to a series of fabrications was nearly unbearable. Sarah wanted to stand up and scream that none of it was true, that she'd been the one getting Emma ready for school every morning, braiding her hair, packing her lunch, reading bedtime stories, attending every doctor's appointment, every school event. But she remained silent, knowing that any outburst would only fuel Harold's narrative about her emotional instability. Then delivered her opening statement, a calm, measured response that highlighted Sarah's 7-year track record as an attentive, loving mother. She presented documentation, Emma's medical records showing all appointments kept, teacher evaluations from Emma's preschool praising the child's emotional stability and social development, character witnesses ready to testify about Sarah's devotion. Spoke about the bond between mother and child, about the harm of unnecessary separation, about the importance of maintaining continuity in a young child's life. It was powerful and persuasive, but as sat back down, Sarah could see the calculation in Judge Thornton's expression. He'd already made preliminary judgments based on the first presentation. The proceedings continued for over 2 hours. David's witnesses were called first. A neighbor that she'd seen Sarah looking disheveled outside the apartment building on 2 occasions. A former colleague mentioned that Sarah had occasionally left work early to pick up Emma from preschool. A custody evaluator, hired by David's lawyer, not court-appointed, opined that Emma might benefit from the more stable, affluent environment David could provide. Each testimony felt like a betrayal, each word twisting the facts into something Sarah barely recognized. It was approaching 11:30 a.m. when the bailiff announced, "The court calls Emma Mitchell." Sarah's head snapped up. This wasn't supposed to happen until after lunch. Emma was supposed to have more time, more preparation. She watched as a door to the side opened, and a woman Sarah recognized as the court-appointed guardian led a small figure into the courtroom. It was Emma, her daughter. After 6 weeks of limited contact, there she was. Emma looked nothing like the confident, happy child from her birthday photos. She wore a pink dress with white socks and black Mary Jane shoes, an outfit Sarah didn't recognize, probably chosen by. Emma's hair was in braids, not the loose waves Sarah had always preferred. Most disturbingly, Emma looked frightened. Her thumb was already in her mouth, a habit she'd broken 2 years ago. Her brown eyes, so like Sarah's own, swept across the courtroom with confusion and fear. When Emma spotted her mother, something flickered in the child's expression. Recognition, longing. But before Sarah could smile reassuringly, David raised his hand in a small wave, and Emma's attention shifted to her father. David smiled warmly, a practiced expression that made Sarah's stomach turn. The judge addressed Emma gently, explaining that she was going to answer some questions, that it was important she tell the truth. Emma nodded mutely, her entire body tense. She climbed into the witness chair, which had been heightened with a special cushion to accommodate her small size. Approached with carefully crafted questions designed to establish Sarah's attentiveness, Emma's comfort in her mother's care. But Emma could barely speak. She whispered her answers, sometimes unintelligible. "Did Mommy always make you breakfast?" asked. Emma nodded but didn't speak. "Do you feel safe with your mommy?" Another nod, accompanied by a soft yes. Emma was shutting down. Sarah could see it happening in real time, the child withdrawing further into herself with each question, her confidence diminishing. Emma started squirming in the chair, swinging her legs nervously. She sucked harder on her thumb. A tear rolled down her cheek, though she made no sound. Judge Thornton observed this with growing concern. He leaned forward and spoke directly to Emma. "This must be very scary, isn't it?" Emma nodded vigorously. "What would help you feel better?" the judge asked gently. Emma looked at him with wide, desperate eyes but didn't answer. She just shook her head, tears now streaming freely down her small face. It was at that precise moment that Judge Thornton made his decision. "We need to take a different approach," he announced, looking toward his bailiff. "Call Officer and Duke. I believe they're available this morning." There was a ripple of confusion through the courtroom. Leaned toward Sarah and whispered, "Court support dogs. Emma will be more comfortable." "Does that help us?" Sarah asked desperately. "It helps," Emma said, "and that's what matters." 5 minutes later, a side door opened. Officer entered first, a man in his mid-40s with kind eyes and the bearing of someone comfortable with authority. He wore a police uniform, but his demeanor was gentle, deliberately non-threatening. Behind him walked a dog that seemed to capture the attention of everyone in the room instantaneously. It was a golden retriever, perhaps 2 years old, with a coat that gleamed like burnished honey under the courtroom lights. The dog moved with perfect training and grace, each step measured and controlled. The animal wore an official service vest that read "Court Support Dog" in clear lettering. The dog's tag jingled softly as he walked. Officer and the golden retriever Duke, according to the vest, approached Emma's position. Emma's entire body went rigid. For a moment she seemed even more frightened by the dog than by the courtroom proceedings. But Officer knelt down to the dog's level and spoke to him softly, demonstrating that the animal was safe, controllable, and harmless. Duke sat obediently, his brown eyes focused entirely on Emma. "This is Duke," Officer said, his voice warm and reassuring. "Duke helps kids feel brave. He's very gentle and he's very smart. Would it be okay if Duke stayed here with you while you talk to the judge?" Emma stared at the dog for a long moment. Duke didn't approach her. He simply sat, his large tail wagging gently, his expression radiating a kindness that transcended species. Slowly, Emma's thumb came out of her mouth. She reached out tentatively, her small fingers extending toward the dog. Duke remained still, allowing Emma to make contact at her own pace. The moment Emma's fingertips touched Duke's soft fur, something shifted. Her shoulders dropped slightly. Her breathing, which had been shallow and rapid, seemed to deepen. Her eyes, red from crying, focused on the dog with a kind of wonder. "Is he soft?" Officer asked gently. "Very soft," Emma whispered. "Would you like to pet him?" asked. Emma nodded and moved her hand more confidently now, her fingers running through Duke's golden coat. She began to relax visibly. The fear in her eyes didn't disappear completely, but it receded, replaced by something more manageable. Officer remained near but not hovering. He gave Emma space to interact with Duke, to discover that this presence, this warm, living, breathing being, offered something the formal courtroom could not: unconditional acceptance. Judge Thornton watched this transformation with something like relief crossing his features. He looked then at Harold, then back at the judge's bench. "We'll continue with Miss Emma's testimony," he said, "but with Duke present." Officer guided Duke to sit directly beside Emma's chair. The dog's large head was at Emma's shoulder height. Sarah watched as her daughter slowly leaned against the golden retriever's body, drawing comfort from the animal's warmth and stillness. Nobody could have anticipated what would come next. Nobody could have predicted that this simple act of compassion, allowing a frightened child the comfort of a trained dog, would become the catalyst that changed everything. But as Emma began to speak again, this time with Duke as her anchor to safety, the nature of the testimony was about to shift in ways that would ultimately shatter David's carefully constructed case. 20 minutes passed with Emma sitting against Duke's warm body, her small fingers continuously stroking the dog's golden coat. Officer remained nearby, alert and observant, his trained eye missing nothing. The courtroom had settled into a strange rhythm. Judge Thornton recessed the direct questioning, while Harold continued their arguments about custody arrangements, financial matters, and school district preferences. The words washed over the proceedings like background noise. Nobody paid attention to the little girl and the police dog in the corner of the courtroom. Nobody except Officer. He'd been working with Duke for nearly 3 years now. Before that, he'd spent 15 years in the police department's violent crimes unit, where he'd learned to read people with extraordinary precision. He understood trauma. He'd interviewed hundreds of victims of abuse, adults who'd finally found the courage to come forward, children who'd been coached or coerced into silence, witnesses who carried the weight of terrible knowledge. He'd seen the 1,000 different ways that fear manifested in a human body. And he was seeing it in Emma Mitchell right now. The child's breathing had stabilized. Her tears had stopped. Physically, she appeared calm, almost serene as she leaned against Duke. But notice the tension in her small shoulders, the way her jaw was clenched, the particular quality of rigidity that came from emotional turmoil being suppressed rather than resolved. Emma began to whisper. It was so quiet that had to strain to hear her, tilting his head slightly, his ear angling toward the child while maintaining his casual posture. He'd learned long ago that showing too much interest made children clam up. They sensed when they were being studied, analyzed, examined. So he pretended to look at nothing in particular, his gaze fixed on some point in the middle distance, while his entire attention focused on Emma's barely audible voice. "Duke is so soft," Emma whispered, her hand moving through the dog's fur in hypnotic, repetitive motions. "You're so nice, Duke. You're so nice." Then almost imperceptibly her voice changed. It became smaller, frightened. "Daddy said don't tell nobody. Daddy said it's a secret. Daddy said if I tell, he'll be very sad." His entire body went on alert, though he didn't move. His breathing remained steady. His expression remained neutral, but his mind was suddenly in overdrive. He began taking surreptitious mental notes, cataloging every word, every shift in Emma's tone. This was it. This was the moment when truth began to emerge. He'd learned that children rarely disclosed abuse directly. Instead, they hinted at it. They tested the waters. They spoke in whispers and fragments, watching to see if the adult would listen, truly listen, without judgment or panic. Emma continued stroking Duke, and her whispers continued, still so quiet that had to concentrate intensely to hear. He said, "I'm a big girl now." He said, "Big girls don't cry." He said, Emma's voice trembled. He said, "It's normal." He said, "All daddies do it." Felt his hands clench into fists in his lap. He kept them hidden beneath the table. He was trained for this, had handled countless cases, but the anger never went away. The rage at adults who hurt children never diminished, no matter how much experience you accumulated. "Is it okay, Duke?" Emma asked the dog, as if seeking permission to continue. Duke's tail thumped softly against the courtroom floor. "You think I should tell?" "Daddy's friend comes at night," Emma whispered next. "His name is Robert. He comes after I'm supposed to be asleep. Daddy says if I wake up and see him, I shouldn't say nothing. He says it's grown-up business." His jaw tightened imperceptibly. Robert. He filed the name away. The pieces were starting to come together, and none of them formed a picture he could accept. Emma's whispers became more fragmented now, more emotional, though her voice remained barely audible. "It hurts, Duke. It hurts when he touches me. I don't like it. I tell him I don't like it, but he says I'm confused. He says I like it really. But I don't. I really don't." In the background, Harold was droning on about Emma's adjustment to her new school district, about the superior educational opportunities available in David's neighborhood. The irony was sickening. Here was a man arguing for David's fitness as a parent while, in the corner of the courtroom, his client's daughter was confessing to abuse by that very client. Emma had gone quiet now. Her hand had stopped moving through Duke's fur. She was just holding onto the dog, breathing against his neck, finding solace in the animal's unchanging presence. Allowed the silence to extend for a full minute, giving Emma space to gather herself, to process the monumental act of disclosure she'd just performed. Children who talked about abuse often needed to decompress afterward. They'd release something enormous, something they'd been carrying in complete isolation. Finally shifted slightly, drawing Emma's attention. He didn't speak directly about what he'd heard. Instead, he asked quietly, "Is Duke helping you feel brave?" Emma nodded against the dog's shoulder. "That's good," said. "Duke is very good at helping people feel brave." "Can Duke stay with me?" Emma asked, and her voice contained such desperate pleading that felt his heart break in his chest. "Yes," he said, "Duke will stay right here with you." Throughout the rest of the morning, Emma remained physically attached to Duke, her hand never leaving the dog's fur, her body never separating from his warmth. But something fundamental had shifted. The truth had been spoken, even if only to a police dog and a trained officer. The secret had begun to lose its power. Emma's body slowly began to relax, degree by degree, as if the act of disclosure had released some of the immense pressure that had been crushing her from the inside. His mind was already working through the next steps. He needed to document everything he'd heard. He needed to alert the judge at the appropriate moment. He needed to ensure that Emma was protected, that her safety became the paramount concern. He pulled out a small notepad from his pocket, the kind he carried specifically for such situations, and began writing cryptic notes, using shorthand and abbreviations that would mean nothing to anyone else but everything to him and the proper authorities. "Reported disclosure," he wrote. "Child states unwanted touching by paternal father and unknown male Robert. States awareness of abuse pattern. Appears systematically conditioned into silence." The words on the page looked stark, brutal, undeniable. Officer had been in law enforcement long enough to understand that what had just happened in this courtroom would set off a cascade of consequences. The custody hearing would become secondary. The criminal investigation would become primary. Emma's testimony, fragile as it was, had just become the most important thing in this entire proceeding. He glanced at Sarah, Emma's mother, who was watching her daughter with an expression of profound concern. Sarah didn't know yet what her child had disclosed. Nobody did except Officer and Duke. But soon, everyone would know. The truth was coming out, one whispered confession at a time, spoken to a golden retriever in the corner of a courthouse on an ordinary morning that was about to become extraordinary. The courtroom clock showed 1:47 p.m. when Judge Thornton reconvened the hearing after the lunch recess. Most participants had eaten hastily, consumed by the stress and tension of the proceeding. Sarah had barely choked down half a sandwich before pulled her aside and told her they were calling Emma back to testify, this time formally, on the record, with both lawyers present to examine her. Sarah's stomach churned. Emma had already endured so much this morning. Could she really withstand more questioning? Officer had spent his lunch hour making crucial phone calls. The sexual abuse accusations needed to be documented with proper authorities immediately. He'd contacted the Hamilton County Child Protective Services, the Sexual Assault Unit, and his supervisor. By the time he returned to the courthouse, a file had been opened and protocols were being activated. Nobody had told David or his lawyer what had been set in motion. The afternoon session would unfold without them, understanding the magnitude of what was about to transpire. Emma entered the courtroom holding Duke's leash, a detail that made Sarah's heart ache with pity. The little girl looked exhausted, her eyes red-rimmed, her body moving with the deliberate slowness of someone carrying an enormous weight. Officer walked beside her, his presence solid and reassuring. Emma climbed into the elevated witness chair, Duke immediately assuming his position beside her. The dog's leash was held loosely, allowing Emma the comfort of his nearness while maintaining proper courtroom protocol. Judge Thornton began with gentle instruction. Emma, I need you to tell the truth today just like always. Do you understand? Yes, Emma whispered. And do you know what it means to tell the truth? It means, say what really happened, Emma said, her thumb creeping toward her mouth before she pulled it away, as if consciously trying to appear older. That's right. Now your mother's lawyer is going to ask you some questions. It's okay to answer her. She wants to help you. Approach slowly, her demeanor carefully calibrated to seem non-threatening, warm, almost grandmotherly. She began with softball questions, establishing Emma's daily routine, her relationship with Sarah, her comfort level at her mother's apartment. Emma answered in whispers, but the answers came more readily than they had during the morning session. Duke's presence seemed to give her confidence. Each time Emma's voice wavered, she would glance at the dog, as if drawing courage from his steadfast companionship. Emma, I want to ask you about your daddy's house, said gently. Do you like staying at Daddy's house? Emma's entire body went rigid. Her hand gripped Duke's fur so tightly the dog shifted slightly, repositioning to give her better support. Sometimes, Emma said very quietly. When don't you like it? Asked, her voice even gentler. When people come. A ripple went through the courtroom. Sarah leaned forward in her seat, every nerve suddenly electrified. Across the aisle, David's jaw tightened. Harold touched his client's arm, a warning gesture. What people? Pressed carefully. Daddy's friend. Does this friend have a name? Emma nodded slowly. Robert. Officer, standing near the judge's bench, had already pulled out his notepad. He was writing rapidly, capturing every word, every exchange. David's face had gone pale. Sitting behind him, had pressed a hand to her mouth, her expression shifting from complacent confidence to something darker and more complicated. What happens when Robert comes to Daddy's house? Asked. He comes at night. What do you do when he comes? I'm supposed to be sleeping, Emma said. Daddy says I should be sleeping. But are you sleeping? Asked. Emma shook her head vigorously. He wakes me up, Robert does. He comes to my room and he touches me. The silence in the courtroom was absolute. Not a single person moved. Not a single person breathed. Harold tried to stand, clearly intending to object, but Judge Thornton's look silenced him. The judge's expression had transformed from judicial neutrality to something approaching controlled fury. Emma continued, her voice steady despite the monumental nature of the conversation. When Robert touches you, where does he touch you? This was the critical question, the specific details that would make the difference between accusation and evidence. Emma looked at Duke. She reached out and pulled the dog's leash closer, drawing the animal's face near to hers as if seeking permission. Duke remained still, present, patient. Emma whispered something into the dog's ear. Officer moved slightly closer, his hand near his radio, ready to summon medical personnel if needed. "I can't say it," Emma said, her voice breaking. "I can't say the words." Paused, glancing at the judge. Judge Thornton leaned forward. "Emma, it's very important. Can you show with your hands where he touches you?" With trembling fingers, Emma pointed to the area between her legs. Then she pointed to her chest. Then to her buttocks. The anatomical specificity made it undeniably clear that this was not confusion or misunderstanding. This was a child describing sexual abuse with the particular precision that comes from lived experience. Sarah's hand flew to her mouth. She felt as though she couldn't breathe. Her daughter, her precious daughter, had been violated in the most horrific way. The knowledge crashed over her like a tsunami, drowning her in guilt, rage, and maternal heartbreak. Jennifer, sitting beside her, grabbed her hand fiercely, holding her anchor to reality. "Did Daddy know that Robert was touching you like this?" asked. "Daddy said it was okay," Emma said, and those 5 words seemed to shatter something fundamental in the courtroom. "Daddy said all daddies do it. He said I was lucky." David's attorney finally found his voice. "Objection. This is hearsay and entirely prejudicial." "Overruled," Judge Thornton snapped. His voice was sharp, dangerous. "Continue." Harold tried again. "Your Honor, I need to cross-examine." "Not yet," the judge said coldly. "Miss Emma, did your daddy ever tell you not to tell your mommy about this?" Emma nodded, tears now streaming down her face. "Daddy said mommy would be sad. He said if I told mommy, she couldn't be my mommy anymore." The implication was staggering. David hadn't just failed to protect his daughter from abuse. He'd actively participated in her silencing. He'd weaponized her love for her mother against her own safety. Officer's hand moved to his radio. He spoke quietly into it. "Code response needed. We have a child abuse disclosure. Prepare for emergency removal from the courtroom." Looked at Emma with profound compassion. "You were very brave to tell us, Emma. You were very, very brave." "Can Duke come with me?" Emma asked desperately. "I want Duke." "Yes," officer said, moving forward to stand beside the witness chair. "Duke will stay with you. Duke will always be here to help you be brave." Judge Thornton's gavel came down with a sound like thunder. "This hearing is suspended pending criminal investigation. Officer, I'm placing you in charge of ensuring this child's immediate safety. Child Protective Services is being contacted immediately. This court is adjourned." The courtroom erupted. David jumped to his feet, his composure shattering. His attorney was shouting objections. The bailiff was moving to restrain David before he could approach Emma, had disappeared toward the back of the courtroom. In the center of the chaos, Emma sat with Duke, the dog having somehow intuited the enormity of the moment, pressing his entire body against the child, a living shield of love and protection. Sarah ran forward, desperate to reach her daughter, but officer gently intercepted her. "She's going to need to be examined by a medical professional first," he said quietly. "It's protocol for evidence documentation, but you can ride with her. You can be with her." "My baby," Sarah sobbed. "Oh God, my baby." "She's alive," officer said firmly. "She told the truth, she's safe now, and she did it." In that moment, as paramedics arrived and the machinery of child protection was activated, the true magnitude of Emma's courage became apparent. A 3-year-old child, in a courtroom full of powerful adults, had found the strength to speak the unspeakable. The consequences would be profound and far-reaching, but in this moment, Emma Mitchell had reclaimed her own narrative. Duke remained at her side as promised, through every moment that followed. The Hamilton County Medical Center's pediatric ward was quiet on that Tuesday afternoon. Emma sat on an examination table in a specially designed room called the Child Advocacy Center, a space that looked more like a comfortable bedroom than a clinical facility, designed specifically to minimize trauma during medical evaluations for suspected abuse. Sarah held her daughter's hand while Dr., a pediatric sexual abuse specialist, conducted the examination. Officers stood outside the room, monitoring through a one-way window, documenting everything with methodical precision. Doctor was in her 50s, with kind eyes and a bedside manner honed through 20 years of examining abused children. She spoke to Emma with extraordinary gentleness, explaining each step before she performed it. "I'm going to look at your belly now, okay? It might feel a little cold." Emma nodded, clutching Duke's leash. The dog remained calm, a living pressure point of safety against the child's leg. The physical examination took 40 minutes. What emerged was a constellation of findings consistent with sexual abuse. There were minor tears in the hymen. There were bruising patterns on the inner thighs. There were microscopic fibers under Emma's fingernails, fibers that would later be matched to Robert Finch's clothing. Each finding was photographed, documented, and carefully placed in evidence bags. Sarah watched her daughter's body be examined like a crime scene, and with each revelation, her rage and guilt intensified to nearly unbearable levels. "She has evidence of abuse," Doctor said quietly to Sarah, an officer, afterward. "The findings are consistent with her statements. She needs to be seen by a trauma psychologist. The psychological impact of this will be significant and long-lasting." While Emma was being medically evaluated, Officer had initiated a full-scale investigation. He'd immediately obtained a warrant to search David Mitchell's home. By 3:15 p.m., a team of forensic technicians was photographing David's bedroom, Emma's bedroom, the guest bedroom where Robert Finch allegedly stayed. They collected bedding, carpet samples, hair samples from David's hairbrush. They confiscated David's computer and Robert Finch's phone, which had been left on the kitchen counter, a stroke of incredible luck that would prove invaluable to the investigation. Had also begun conducting interviews. He sat across from the neighbor who'd mentioned seeing Sarah looking disheveled. A woman named Helen Peterman approached the interview with a different angle than the custody case lawyers had. "Mrs. Peterman, have you ever noticed anything unusual at David Mitchell's residence?" asked. Helen's demeanor changed immediately. "Well, actually, yes. There's a man who visits late at night. I've seen his car in the driveway after midnight multiple times, a blue sedan. I never thought much of it, but is something wrong?" "Do you know this man's name?" "Robert something. I've only seen him a few times and only in passing." Felt the pieces beginning to align. He obtained a list of David's known associates and cross-referenced it with names beginning with Robert. He found 7 possibilities, then narrowed it down through phone records to Robert Finch, age 38, with a previous conviction for indecent exposure in 2019. The case was building. By 5:30 p.m. had obtained a second warrant, this one for Robert Finch's residence across town. What they found there would become crucial to the prosecution. Finch had apparently kept a journal, a deeply disturbing document that detailed his abuse of Emma in clinical, predatory language. There were photographs. There were video files. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. At 6:45 p.m., David Mitchell was arrested at his office. He maintained his composure during the arrest, but could see the calculation in his eyes. He was already thinking about lawyers, about bail, about damage control. Robert Finch was arrested at his apartment at 7:20 p.m. Unlike David, Finch fought the arrest, screaming accusations and denials even as he was being placed in handcuffs. watched with cold satisfaction as the man who devastated Emma Mitchell was led away to custody. Sarah received the news of the arrests while sitting in a quiet room with Emma and Duke. Her daughter had fallen asleep against the dog's body, the trauma of disclosure and medical examination having exhausted her completely. When officer entered and told her that both David and Robert had been arrested and were being charged with multiple counts of child sexual abuse, Sarah felt something inside her shift. Not peace. She would never feel peace again knowing what had been done to her child. But perhaps a fraction of justice, a beginning. "What happens now?" she asked officer. "The investigation will continue," explained. "We'll build the case for prosecution. Emma will need counseling, possibly therapy. There will be a trial eventually, but for now she's safe. She's with you. That's what matters." Over the next week, the investigation expanded further. Interviewed teachers from Emma's preschool, who reported that Emma had exhibited behavioral changes over the past several months: increased anxiety, regression in potty training, reluctance to be alone with adults. He interviewed David's previous girlfriend, who disclosed that David had shown inappropriate interest in young girls during their relationship. Each interview added another layer to the emerging picture of David Mitchell as a predator who deliberately placed his own daughter in harm's way. The forensic analysis of digital evidence proved to be Robert Finch's phone contained communications with David discussing opportunities, coordinating visits, and discussing Emma in explicitly sexual terms. David's computer contained searches for child abuse material and articles about how to prevent children from disclosing abuse. The evidence was so substantial that supervisor, Detective Lieutenant Susan, pulled him aside and told him bluntly, "This is one of the strongest cases I've seen in my 25 years on the force. These men are going to prison for a very long time." Sarah hired a victim advocacy attorney named Robert Hayes, who specialized in child abuse cases. Hayes was thorough, meticulous, and committed to ensuring that the legal system provided Emma with every possible protection. He worked to coordinate the investigation, advising on additional evidence needed for prosecution. By the second week, the story had leaked to the local media. It was initially reported as a routine child abuse case, but when reporters discovered that the abuse had been disclosed in a custody courtroom to a police dog, the narrative exploded. National news outlets began picking up the story. "Court support dog helps child abuse victim find voice," the headlines read. "Child's courage leads to arrest of two predators." Officer and Duke suddenly found themselves at the center of a media firestorm. Judge Thornton issued an order sealing most of the records to protect Emma's privacy, but the essential facts were already public knowledge. David Mitchell and Robert Finch had been charged with multiple counts of child sexual abuse, endangerment, and failure to protect. Both were being held without bail pending trial. Both had retained expensive defense attorneys who began filing motions to dismiss, claiming the investigation was biased and Emma's testimony was unreliable. But Officer had documentation. He had evidence. He had a timeline that was consistent, corroborated, and compelling. He had medical findings that aligned with Emma's statements. He had digital evidence that revealed intent and predatory behavior. Most importantly, he had a child's courage, a 3-year-old girl who'd found the strength to speak truth to power to a police dog in a courtroom. Sarah held Emma close each night, watching her daughter sleep, grateful that her child had lived, grateful that Emma had been brave enough to disclose, grateful that a golden retriever had been present to facilitate that disclosure. The investigation was ongoing, but the direction was clear. Justice was coming. It wouldn't erase what had been done. It wouldn't heal what had been broken, but it would prevent future victims. It would hold predators accountable. And it had all begun because someone had the compassion to bring a dog into a courtroom. The basement office of Hamilton County Courthouse had been transformed. What was once a sterile storage room had been converted into a therapeutic space designed specifically for traumatized children. Soft carpet covered the concrete floor. A comfortable couch sat against one wall, alongside oversized cushions and bean-bag chairs in calming blues and greens. Warm lighting replaced the harsh fluorescence. Shelves held books, art supplies, and toys chosen specifically for their therapeutic value rather than their entertainment capacity. It was in this space, 3 weeks after Emma's courtroom disclosure, that the real healing began. Doctor, the same pediatric specialist who conducted Emma's initial medical examination, had recommended ongoing trauma therapy. She'd explained to Sarah that children who'd experienced sexual abuse often developed complex post-traumatic stress responses, nightmares, anxiety, regression, behavioral changes, trust issues. The trauma didn't disappear with disclosure. In many ways, disclosure was only the beginning of a long, difficult journey toward healing. Judge Thornton had made an extraordinary decision. He'd approved a program where Emma could receive weekly therapy sessions with Officer and Duke present. This wasn't standard protocol, but the judge had recognized something unique in the bond between Emma and the dog. He'd seen how Duke had facilitated Emma's courage in the courtroom. He believed that same connection could facilitate Emma's healing in a therapeutic setting. The first session was scheduled for Tuesday at 2:00 p.m. Sarah arrived early, holding Emma's hand, feeling her daughter's anxiety through the trembling in her small fingers. Emma was dressed in a new outfit, something Sarah had carefully selected to make her feel special and protected. Emma carried a small notebook and colored pencils, items Doctor had suggested as non-verbal communication tools for children who couldn't articulate their trauma through words alone. Officer stood when they entered, Duke rising beside him, tail wagging gently. "Welcome, Emma," said softly. "Duke has been very excited to see you. He's been thinking about you all week." Emma's entire expression changed. She released Sarah's hand and moved toward Duke, her pace slow but determined. The dog's entire body seemed to vibrate with joy, but he remained sitting, allowing Emma to control their interaction. Emma wrapped her arms around Duke's neck, burying her face in his golden fur. "You came," she whispered. "You really came." "Of course I came," Officer said, though he was really speaking through Duke. "I promised I would always be here." Sarah sat in a chair positioned slightly back from the therapeutic circle, close enough to support Emma but far enough to allow the child space to work. Doctor sat across from them, her posture open and welcoming. "Today we're just going to talk," Doctor explained to Emma. "We can talk about happy things or sad things. We can draw. We can just sit with Duke. There's no wrong way to do this." The first session lasted 45 minutes. Emma spent most of it with Duke, stroking his fur, occasionally whispering to the dog things she couldn't say aloud. She drew a picture, stick figures with large scribbles of black crayon over some of them. When asked about the drawing, she identified the black scribbles as bad feelings. Doctor didn't push. She simply documented, validated, and created space for Emma's emotional expression. As the weeks progressed, the sessions became more intensive and more healing. Emma began to articulate her trauma through art therapy. She drew pictures of her bedroom, adding violent red and black colors to represent the abuse. She drew pictures of Duke protecting her. She drew pictures of her mother with hearts around them. In one session, she painted an enormous golden dog with wings, Duke as her angel. The verbal processing was more gradual. Emma began by telling Duke her feelings through whispered confessions, exactly as she had in the courtroom. "I feel scared," she might say. "I feel angry." Over time, she began to articulate specific fears. "I'm scared that Daddy will come get me. I'm scared that nobody will believe me. I'm scared that it was my fault." Doctor gently addressed each fear. "It was never your fault, Emma. Your body is yours. Nobody has the right to touch it in ways that make you uncomfortable. It was never your fault." Sarah watched this process unfold, her mother's heart both breaking and slowly beginning to heal alongside her daughter. She saw Emma gradually reclaiming her sense of safety, her sense of self. The nightmares decreased in frequency, then intensity. The stopped. Emma started sleeping through entire nights, sometimes curled against a stuffed dog Sarah had purchased that reminded Emma of Duke. 6 weeks into the therapy sessions, Emma experienced what doctor called a breakthrough moment. She was sitting with Duke, and she suddenly looked at Officer and said clearly, "I want to tell what happened. I want to say the words." What followed was Emma's first detailed verbal disclosure of her abuse. She described the abuse systematically, identifying specific instances, specific actions, specific words that had been said to her. She described how David had explained that this is how daddies show love. She described how Robert Finch had told her that this would be our special secret. She described the pain, the fear, the confusion. Officer recorded the session with Emma's knowledge and consent. The recording would become powerful evidence for the prosecution. But more importantly, Emma was reclaiming her narrative. She wasn't whispering to a dog. She was declaring her truth clearly, directly, unambiguously. "How do you feel now that you've said it all?" Doctor asked gently. "Better," Emma said. "My heart doesn't hurt as much, but I'm still sad." "That's okay," Doctor assured her. "Healing isn't about not being sad. It's about being sad and still being okay." 3 months into the therapy process, something remarkable happened. Emma and Duke had bonded so deeply that they developed an almost telepathic connection. Emma could read Duke's moods, and the dog seemed to understand Emma's emotional state with uncanny precision. When Emma was having a difficult day, Duke would position himself closer, more attentively. When Emma was having a good day, Duke seemed to celebrate with her, his entire demeanor lighter and more playful. Sarah began to see her daughter's personality re-emerging. Emma laughed more frequently. She engaged in play without the haunted quality that had characterized it immediately after disclosure. She talked about her future in a way that suggested she believed she had one. "When I grow up," she told Officer one day, "I want to help kids like Duke does. I want to make people feel brave." The impact on Sarah was equally profound but different. Watching her daughter heal helped ease some of Sarah's maternal guilt, though it never fully disappeared. She'd been blamed for the abuse in David's initial custody filing, as if her working full-time meant she deserved to lose her daughter. Nobody had ever considered that David was using the custody case as cover for his predatory behavior. But as Emma healed, Sarah began to understand that the system, imperfect as it was, had ultimately protected her daughter. A judge's compassion, a dog's gentleness, an officer's vigilance. These forces had combined to save Emma's life. On the 6-month anniversary of Emma's disclosure, Doctor assessed Emma's progress. Her anxiety levels had decreased significantly. Her trauma responses had diminished. She was engaging normally with peers. She was sleeping well. She was processing her trauma in healthy ways. She still had difficult days, still had moments when memories surfaced and overwhelmed her. But she was healing. Genuinely, measurably healing. "Emma has shown remarkable resilience," Doctor told Sarah. "Children are more resilient than we often give them credit for. But Emma had something crucial. She had people who believed her, who protected her, and who helped her process her trauma. She had Duke. That made all the difference." Sarah looked at her daughter, playing with Duke in the corner of the office, laughing as the dog's tail thumped against the floor. This child had been shattered by abuse, but this child was being put back together, not by forgetting, but by processing, by expressing, by being believed and protected. Emma would carry the scars of her trauma forever, but she was learning to live with them, to move forward, to build a future that included hope. The trial of David Mitchell and Robert Finch began on a cold Tuesday morning in October, 7 months after Emma's disclosure. The case had become a media sensation. News vans lined the courthouse parking lot. Reporters camped outside with cameras and microphones. Judge Thornton had issued strict orders limiting media access to the courtroom itself, but the public interest remained intense. This was no longer just a case about child sexual abuse. It was a case about the intersection of the legal system and innovative child protection practices. It was about a 3-year-old's courage and a police dog's role in facilitating justice. Sarah arrived at the courthouse with Emma, Officer, and Duke. Emma was 5 years old now, older, wiser, and carrying the weight of knowing that her testimony would determine the fates of 2 men. She held Duke's leash with one hand and Sarah's hand with the other. She was dressed carefully in a simple blue dress, her hair braided, her appearance deliberately vulnerable and childlike. Doctor had advised this. Juries needed to see not a prepared witness but a genuine child. The courtroom was packed. Victim advocates filled the gallery. Child protection specialists from across the country had traveled to observe the trial. Academic researchers were documenting the case for law journals. In the back row sat Harold, David's attorney, a man whose custody case tactics had been exposed as complicit in facilitating abuse. He looked diminished, less confident than he had at the initial hearing. The prosecution's case was methodical and devastating. Assistant District Attorney Thornton, no relation to the judge, presented the evidence with surgical precision. She began with Officer's testimony, where he described the courtroom disclosure and the subsequent investigation. The jury listened, riveted, as detailed the search warrant executions, the digital evidence, the interview findings. Then came the medical evidence. Doctor about Emma's physical findings, the bruising patterns, the microscopic evidence of abuse. She explained that the injuries were consistent with Emma's statements and inconsistent with consensual contact. She spoke in clinical terms that translated the abstract concept of child sexual abuse into concrete biological reality. The digital evidence was perhaps the most damning. The prosecution introduced excerpts from Robert Finch's journal, carefully selected passages that made clear his predatory intentions and systematic abuse. They presented text messages between David and Robert coordinating visits and discussing Emma. They presented search histories from David's computer that showed he'd researched how to prevent children from disclosing abuse. Each piece of evidence was like another nail in the coffin of the defense's case. Then came Emma's testimony. She entered the courtroom holding Duke's leash, officer positioned nearby. Judge Thornton addressed the jury. This child will be testifying under oath. She understands the importance of telling the truth. She also understands that a dog will be present to help her feel safe. This is a legitimate accommodation for a child witness who has experienced trauma. Thornton approached Emma gently. Emma, I need to ask you some very important questions. Are you ready? Emma looked at Duke. The dog's tail thumped softly. Emma nodded. Can you tell the jury what happened to you at your daddy's house? What followed was a testimony that would be discussed in legal classrooms for years. Emma spoke with the clarity and specificity that came from months of therapy and processing. She described the abuse systematically. She identified both David and Robert with absolute certainty. She explained how she'd been told not to tell, how she'd been frightened, how she'd eventually found the courage to speak because Duke showed me I could be brave. The jury members wept openly. One woman dabbed at her eyes with a tissue throughout Emma's entire testimony. When Emma finished and said quietly, "That's the truth," there was a moment of absolute silence in the courtroom, as if everyone was processing the weight of what they'd just heard. The defense's cross-examination was brutal but unsuccessful. David's attorney attempted to suggest that Emma's story had been coached, that she'd been influenced by suggestive therapy, that her relationship with Duke had created false memories. But Emma remained steadfast and consistent. She didn't change her story. She didn't become confused. She didn't contradict herself. After 40 minutes of intensive questioning, even the defense attorney seemed to accept the futility of his approach. Robert Finch's attorney attempted to distance his client from David's actions, arguing that Robert had been a peripheral figure with limited knowledge of David's parenting choices. But the journal entries destroyed this defense completely. Robert's own words, written in his hand, stored on his electronic devices, proved intent, predatory behavior, and systematic abuse. The defense had no response to this evidence. The prosecution's closing argument was powerful. Thornton stood before the jury and pointed directly at Emma, who sat with Duke in the gallery. "This child," she said, her voice resonating through the courtroom, "showed more courage than most adults could muster. She faced her abusers in this courtroom. She told her truth. She didn't back down. She didn't change her story. She demanded justice. And now it's your responsibility to deliver it." The jury deliberated for 8 hours over 2 days. When they returned, their verdict was unanimous on all counts: guilty of child sexual abuse, guilty of endangerment, guilty of failure to protect. David Mitchell was convicted on 6 counts of child sexual abuse and 2 counts of failure to protect. Robert Finch was convicted on 8 counts of child sexual abuse and 2 counts of endangerment. The courtroom erupted. Sarah pulled Emma close, tears streaming down her face. Emma looked at Duke and whispered, "We won. We told the truth and we won." Sentencing came 2 weeks later. Judge Thornton addressed both men before delivering his sentences with evident disgust. "You have preyed on a child who could not protect herself. You have violated her in the most profound ways. You have attempted to silence her through intimidation and manipulation. But this child found her voice, and because she did, you will face the consequences of your actions." David Mitchell received 28 years in prison, effectively a life sentence given his age. Robert Finch received 32 years in prison. Both would be registered as sex offenders for life. Both would face ongoing legal consequences, including civil suits from Sarah and ongoing restitution requirements. The national impact was immediate and significant. Legal scholars began publishing articles about the case. Law schools incorporated Emma's trial into courses on child testimony. The American Psychological Association recognized the validity of court support dogs in child protection cases. States across the country began implementing court dogs for child advocates, programs modeled on Duke's service. Officer and Duke were invited to speak at law enforcement conferences, child advocacy organizations, and universities. Was careful to protect Emma's privacy while using her story to advocate for systemic change. "What Emma teaches us," he would say, "is that children can tell us what's happening to them if we create safe spaces for them to speak. A dog isn't the only solution, but it's a solution that works. It's a tool that removes the barrier between silence and disclosure. And when a child speaks, everything changes." 6 months after the sentencing, Duke received an official commendation from the Hamilton County Police Department. Emma, now 5 years old and noticeably more confident, presented the award to Officer. She hugged Duke and spoke into the microphone. "Duke saved me. Officer believed me. My mommy loves me. And now nobody can hurt me anymore." Sarah stood beside her daughter, bursting with pride and gratitude. What had begun as a desperate custody battle had transformed into a landmark case that would protect countless children in the years to come. Emma Mitchell's courage, facilitated by a golden retriever's unconditional presence, had not just delivered personal justice. It had changed the entire system. 2 years after Emma's testimony sent shockwaves through the courtroom, the gymnasium at Hamilton County Civic Center was filled with police officers, judges, child protection specialists, educators, and advocates from across the nation. The occasion was the official dedication of the Court Dogs for Child Advocates national program, a systemic initiative born directly from Emma Mitchell's courage and one dog's extraordinary service. Emma stood backstage, no longer 5 years old but 7, having matured in ways that transcended her chronological age. She wore a pale blue dress with white stockings, her hair curled, a small corsage pinned to her chest. Sarah stood beside her daughter, her hand resting gently on Emma's shoulder, feeling the child's nervous energy. "Are you ready?" Sarah asked softly. "I'm scared," Emma admitted. "There are so many people out there." "I know," Sarah said, "but remember what Officer always tells you. You're brave. You've already done the bravest thing anyone could do. This is just talking about it." Emma took a deep breath. She reached down to adjust Duke's service vest. The dog, now 5 years old himself, had become an international symbol of child advocacy. His photograph had appeared in dozens of news articles, academic papers, and child protection training materials. But Emma's connection to Duke remained intensely personal. She alone seemed to truly understand what the dog had given her, not just comfort in a courtroom, but a bridge between silence and truth. Officer appeared, standing in his dress uniform, his expression warm and encouraging. "It's time," he said gently. The gymnasium erupted in applause as Emma, Sarah, Officer, and Duke emerged onto the stage. Emma's eyes widened at the sheer magnitude of the crowd. Her hand instinctively gripped Duke's leash. The dog responded by pressing closer to her, his body a living shield against the enormity of the moment. Judge Richard Thornton, who'd presided over the initial hearing that had changed everything, stood to welcome them. His expression was filled with pride and something deeper, perhaps relief that the system had ultimately worked, that a child had been protected and believed. 2 years ago, Judge Thornton began, his voice carrying through the sound system, a small child spoke truth to power. She did so with the assistance of an extraordinary dog and the support of dedicated professionals. Today, we celebrate not just that child's courage, but the systemic changes her courage has inspired. The program that followed detailed the national expansion of court support dogs. 37 states had now established programs. Over 200 dogs had been trained and certified. In those 2 years, more than 1,000 child victims had been able to disclose abuse through the support of these trained animals. The numbers spoke volumes about what Emma's story had made possible. Officer took the microphone. He spoke about the importance of believing children, of creating safe spaces for disclosure, of understanding that trauma doesn't diminish a child's credibility, it contextualizes it. He spoke about Duke's training, about the science behind human-animal bonding, about the concrete reality that a gentle presence could bridge the gap between terror and truth. Emma Mitchell changed everything, said, looking directly at the child on stage. She showed us that children, even very young children, have the capacity to speak about their experiences if we create environments where they feel safe enough to do so. She showed us that conventional courtroom procedures can be adapted to serve children's needs. She showed us that justice is possible when we listen. Then it was Emma's turn. She approached the microphone slowly, Duke walking beside her. The audience fell silent. A 7-year-old girl in a blue dress, standing before hundreds of professionals and advocates, about to speak about the most difficult experience of her life. "I'm Emma," she said simply. Her voice, while small, carried clearly through the sound system. "When I was 3 years old, I was hurt by people who were supposed to protect me. I didn't know how to tell anyone because they told me not to tell. But then I met Duke." She paused, stroking the dog's head. Duke's tail wagged gently, and the entire audience seemed to hold its breath. "Duke didn't make me tell," Emma continued. "Duke just showed me I was safe. And when I felt safe, I could tell the truth. I told in a courtroom and people believed me. And now those people are in prison and I'm safe." Emma looked out at the crowd. "I want to tell all the kids who are scared and hurt like I was, you're not alone. There are people who want to believe you. There are animals who can help you feel brave. And telling the truth can save you." The gymnasium erupted in standing ovation. Sarah felt tears streaming down her face as her daughter stepped back from the microphone. Emma immediately returned to Duke, wrapping her arms around the dog's neck. Officer placed his hand gently on Emma's shoulder, the three of them forming a tableau that somehow encompassed everything the program represented. Over the next several hours, there were formal presentations about the program's structure, its outcomes, its cost-effectiveness. Speakers detailed how court support dogs had increased disclosure rates by 43% among child abuse victims. They discussed how the presence of dogs had decreased the trauma of courtroom testimony for vulnerable children. They presented case studies of children whose lives had been saved, because they felt safe enough to speak. But what struck the audience most powerfully were the letters. Hundreds of them, from children and families across the country who'd benefited from the program. A 7-year-old boy who disclosed abuse at his school. A 9-year-old girl who'd come forward about trafficking. A 6-year-old who'd finally been able to talk about neglect. Each letter included a drawing, often featuring a golden or black dog, often including the child's understanding that the dog had helped them be brave. Sarah spent the evening reflecting on her daughter's transformation. Emma had gone from a terrified 3-year-old victim to a poised 7-year-old advocate. She still had difficult days. She still had nightmares occasionally. She still struggled with trust in certain situations. But she'd also learned resilience, confidence, and the knowledge that her voice mattered. Dr. Emma's longtime therapist had written an assessment for the event. Emma Mitchell represents the best possible outcome for a child trauma survivor. She's processed her trauma in healthy ways. She's developed strong attachment relationships. She's beginning to integrate her experience into a broader narrative that includes hope and agency. Most remarkably, she's shown the capacity to transform her personal tragedy into advocacy for others. This is profound psychological resilience. As the evening concluded, Emma sat with Duke in a quiet corner of the gymnasium, away from the crowds and formality. Officer and Sarah stood nearby, giving the child space. Emma leaned against Duke's body, her small hand resting on the dog's chest. "Duke," Emma whispered, "thank you for saving me, and thank you for helping all the other kids." Duke's tail thumped softly. The dog licked Emma's face gently, a gesture of pure, unconditional love that transcended species and articulated everything that couldn't be expressed in words. What had begun as a desperate custody hearing in a courthouse had evolved into a national movement. What had started as a judge's compassionate decision to bring a dog into a courtroom had transformed into a comprehensive system that would help thousands of children find their voices. What had seemed impossible, a 3-year-old child disclosing horrific abuse and being believed, had become the foundation for systemic change. Emma Mitchell would grow up knowing that her courage had mattered. She would understand that trauma, while devastating, could be processed and transcended. She would know that her voice had changed laws, influenced policy, and saved lives. She would graduate high school and college and fulfill her childhood promise to work with child protection agencies. She would eventually establish her own nonprofit devoted to trauma-informed care for abuse survivors. But on this particular evening, she was simply a child, safe and loved, sitting beside the dog who'd helped her speak her truth. Everything else, the systemic changes, the national programs, the transformed legal procedures, all of it emanated from this simple moment of a child and a dog, learning together that truth, when finally spoken, has the power to set people free. Officer watched from a distance, knowing that this case would define his career. Duke would be honored in his retirement, receiving commendations and recognition that few animals ever received. But for the true reward was witnessing this moment. Emma, safe and healing, changing the world one conversation at a time. No one had expected what a 3-year-old would say to a police dog in court. But in that unexpected moment, everything transformed. Emma Mitchell's whispered words to Duke had become the catalyst for a revolution in how society protected its most vulnerable members. And that revolution, begun in silence, was echoing across the nation, giving voice to the voiceless, one child at a time. The end.